Hello, everybody. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi everybody, this is Chen. I'm also based in Austin, Texas. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and the late medieval China. Great to be with you all today.
So, this is a continuation of our conversation on evolutionary psychology and its founding text, Adapted Mind. We have um, talked about the broader structure of evolutionary psychology, and then we went ahead and discussed its main target, main enemy, if you wish, intellectual enemy, the social science, the standard social science model, and then we use that to kind of like talk about the structure of psychology in a more robust way. So we started with that kind of a basic relationship that evolutionary psychology seems to assume between itself and human nature. Then we contrasted it with the standard social science model, and then we kind of put everything, synthesized everything together, and just gave the integrated model that gave exposition to the integrated model that evolutionary psychologists advocate for. The idea with the evolutionary psychology is that number one, human nature exists, and number two, this human nature is in a very specific way uh, a biological fact, meaning that what the locus of human nature is not in culture. Culture itself is an expression of human nature that itself is inherently biological. When we think about this in terms of like biology, we need to go back and look at evolutionary biology, and then see how evolutionary biology is the mother of behavior. Like behavior, according to evolutionary psychologists, come from the adaptations through natural selection in our evolutionary history. Just like the beams of birds uh, were selected based on all sorts of factors related to reproduction and successful mating. The mechanisms are also get selected by natural selection, right? So it's not just like traits as like given morphological entities, but also mechanisms that get selected. And what constitutes human nature are those mechanisms, not just random traits, but just mechanisms. And there are a couple of things that these mechanisms have that evolutionary psychologists are interested in. Number one, there's psychological mechanisms. Number two, there are information processing mechanisms. Number three, they are extremely stable, meaning that they don't change based on like two or three generations of like cultural programming. They were developed in the ancient times when we were hunter gatherers. They're still there with us with no fundamental change. That doesn't mean it's impossible to change them, but definitely, passing a law about gender is not going to change the mechanisms related to sexual mating strategies in humanity, for instance. Um, these highly stable information processing mechanisms are not simply just given at birth in the sense that we don't need to see all of them at once at birth, but they are more like developmental programs. They unfold based on different time frames throughout our life cycle. What differentiates evolutionary psychology from any form of maybe cultural relativism or cultural constructionism, is the fact that culture um, is subordinated to this information processing mechanisms. And one of the main reasons, or one of the main points of contention, is that, according to evolutionary psychologists, these mechanisms are not just like basic capacities; they are content specific, and they are required for reducing the infinite complexity of the world. Meaning that evolutionary biology or the brain as a result of evolutionary biology is not just giving us capacity for culture, it is also giving us the ability to act in certain ways under certain conditions. As an infant, this shows itself in language acquisition and the ability to avoid certain types of dangers. Then when we become teenagers, other developmental strategies get unfolded based on those specific conditions. When you're in the mating position, other psychological mechanisms get enabled, and so on and so forth. And the authors uh, quote William James, I believe, that I think kind of summarizes this point that the difference between human beings and animals is not that human beings have less instincts, but more instincts than other animals. Like we are very in this context, the reason that cats cannot learn symbolic language is not because they have too many instincts and that's just like it's underway. It's because they don't have the instincts required for that kind of noise filtering of utterances in the world that would just eventually make it possible for them to learn a language. So this is just the structure of like what we have talked about. And of course, we talked about specific things about like the evolutionary psychologist's conception of culture, environment, and the concept of learning. Um, you can go back and listen to the last episode for a full exposition of those. One last thing I'm going to say and see what Trent has anything to add is that when it comes to the concept of environment, there is like that's a place that some of these features of the evolutionary psychology really shine, which is that for evolutionary psychologists, environment is always kind of crafted through these pre-existing psychological mechanisms, meaning that the environment, just like the word of sound, is just noise. It is this set of psychological mechanisms that make it possible for us to carve a certain kind of space in this noise and get there and start feeling secure enough to unfold our psychological constitution and like become what we're disposed to become, right? So environment does not have a causal impact on psychological mechanisms, at least not in the scale that is meaningful to any human culture that we know, right? Insofar as the cultural history of humanity goes, no environment has had any impact on the core of psychological mechanisms that are disposed to unfold. In that sense, there is a very clear one unidirectional relationship between psychological mechanisms and environment. Um, and because of this, because everything is ultimately explainable through these psychological mechanisms, there is no learning of behavior really. It is only kind of putting ourselves in a place that what we have quote unquote already learned from evolution can unfold, right? There's no cultural learning as a coherent concept, right?
Yes, I think you did a very good and a comprehensive survey. All I want to add is kind of rhetorical, but in the good old humanist sense of trying to make your complex the summaries in a couple of terms, so maybe listeners can better take away. I think what I see is evolution psychology in this book provides, in my eyes, three very interesting paradoxes or dilemma somehow. First is it's at its core a new Darwinian project, namely that the driving force of life history, human history, is natural selection. And natural selection is at the end of the day a duet, a dance between species and the evolving environment. However, if you look at their proposed model, the locus of whole everything, like the thing that keeps record or keeps that, or we previously called it in the poetic language, a self-remembering mechanism, is firmly in the individual species or individual members of species. It's not in the environment. So that's what I see the first paradox. The natural selection, in my eyes, requires two parties, but here on the dance floor, there's only one person. And the second is when we think about classical evolution theory or whatever, or origin of species, so it seems rather physical to the whole process. Like we're talking about DNA, we're talking about the specific the transcription of, and the production of proteins, but they are saying, well, actually, there is a information dimension to it. That's the most important thing. We're talking about the evolution of a human mind, and we're talking about the evolution of human brain. So that kind of very interesting tension or dynamic there is what are we really talking about here? Is it like are we dealing with the mechanisms that are they information mechanism, processing mechanism, as they said, or do they have a physical material foundation and what's the relationship between the two? I think this is like open space we'll explore in the future. The third and final one, which I think was a great transition to what we're going to discuss today, is so this is at the same time a historical process that human beings couldn't just have eyes overnight, and a lot of quote unquote instincts in James' sense that were accumulated and developed upon years and years of trial and error, natural selection. Therefore, like as you mentioned, like in the horizon provided by documented human history or huge cultural innovation like the formation of modern states, like modern public education, had a close to zero impact on um, the core of human nature. Instead, that's a very important aspect of their book is for over 4 or 5 millions of years, human beings have been living in hunter-gatherer societies. Therefore, if we understand better their living condition, we can understand the package of instincts we carry with us. And so the kind of avert paradox here is human evolution is at the same time a historical process, but as for practical matter, for our study, for cultural interpretation, it's fixed. So yes, human nature is fixed. So I think with that said, we could perhaps proceed to the subject matter of today and to see, and we can invite our resident dating expert, Aran, to tell us how we should
Yeah.
date, select mates. Yes.
So yeah, I think like one thing I think that was a great addition. I just wanted to say that in this in response to the first point that you mentioned
Yes.
that it is I think the evolutionary psychologists would say like the dance has ended, right? Or the dance has like the that kind of environment development of psychological mechanisms has happened. Now this is like an enclosed system, right? Like you just now they are rigidified enough that no environment is gonna cause or impact them in the short run. And that short run is not I'm not talking about 5 years. I'm talking about like the next 100,000 years. So, so I think that would be like the way that they're thinking about it. But what, like the thing that we are like interested in at this point is that okay, so well, sure, like all of this, let's accept all of this. But it seems like that we see a contradictory behavior by human beings, like throughout history, right? Or we see certain behaviors that do not seem to match the exact strategies of these psychological mechanisms. What is the deal with those? And we have three examples: sexual choice, gossip, and social stratification, right? And these are like the possible troublesome cases for evolutionary psychology, right? Uh, the attitude towards like mate value or mate selection based on these kind of ancient psychological mechanisms suggests that like women are gonna pick men who are more resourceful and they have a status and they will reveal power, and that is far important, more important for them than how they look. And but that's not the case in the opposite direction. Like men do not really care about the status or resourcefulness or power of women. They care about how they look, right? So that's just like a very basic, simplified version of the story. Now, there are people who would say that, hey, all of these like strategies for like valuing power, for resourcefulness or status in men on the side of women, that was a very kind of a that's a contingent fact, right? It wasn't like there was any sort of a basic cultural, basic psychological mechanism, um, like as an imperative to action, or just with us. It just happens to be the case that all of those human societies that we have studied have had this kind of a patriarchal structure that the main feature of women were powerlessness. Therefore, they were, of course, they were looking for power. But if you have a society that is not structured that way, then status or power doesn't matter. Uh, and in a very interesting, weird way, like the Marxist um, sociologists also sometimes go on a similar kind of a path. That the behaviors that we see in like a capitalistic society is just it's not like there is something that needs to be explained. Because if you're thinking human beings are so and so, and they're behaving in the capitalist society in so and so, there seems to be some sort of a kind of conflict, right? If you're thinking that human beings have this kind of a social reality, the atomized libertarian individualism of capitalist society may be a problem for a Marxist sociologist, right? What is that? So I think it's interesting to see like how that parallels a Marxist reaction to these types of discrepancies to the claim of fixed nature. The second story is gossip, right? Evolutionary speaking, we need to care about information about people around us, and gossip is a form of, giving minute details of what is happening in the neighborhood, in the club, in the barber shop, like in spaces that we care for, right? But we're obsessed about gossips about people who have no impact on our lives. We don't have any clear social relations about them. Like if Madonna had like plastic surgery, that doesn't really change anything about my life. That information is not relevant, but it's still we're obsessed. So what is that? Like what is that? And lastly, which is something that again I think that kind of a Marxist parallel would be fun to explore is social stratification. One of the benchmark like viewpoints of hunter-gatherer societies is just their egalitarianism, lack of social stratification, but we have that. So it's either or. Like either we have social stratification as part of our psychological mechanisms, or we don't. If we have that as inherently part of our psychological mechanism, why did hunter-gatherers did not have any such social stratification? And if it's not part of our psychological mechanism, then a huge part of what we are socially and hierarchically is just like outside this realm of fixed information processing mechanisms that seems to kind of like turns the whole evolutionary psychology project into something rather irrelevant. Okay, so these are the three cases. Evolutionary psychologists and these like the things that we're going to discuss. They are discussed in the book by other authors. And like especially case issues has an answer to all of these three, right? And there's three different kind of ways that evolutionary psychology kind of deals with these problems. Before we move on, Trent, do you have something to add here?
Yeah, I think I would just want to emphasize that these cases were selected not by us, but by their group as kind of preemptive defense of their system, because these three have extensive literature outside evolutionary psychology. People, sociologists are trying to explain why such thing happened without reference to psychology. And they were saying, well, actually, you know what? you should all your debates are kind of baseless unless you connect your stuff with what we propose here. So that's why we are in this episode trying to kind of briefly represent their argument why evolution and psychology could provide insight on these three like heatedly debated sociological questions. Yes.
Yes, and in that sense, how it can show that this like argue that these are not in any way refutations of the main argument of evolutionary psychology. This is actually very much confirmation of evolutionary psychology. So the first thing is like, and again, these are the specific cases they have picked, and I think while looking at them, we kind of find different like categories of responses that evolutionary psychologists could have to any form of like claim of discrepancy or claim of deviation or claim of change in psychological mechanisms. One such answer is that there hasn't been a change. There is a clear logical continuity, right? In the sense that it's in a very straightforward that hasn't changed. We see that in the case of sexual choice, right? And the articles surrounding that in Adapted Mind, they go through like many layers, but the kind of the core of it, I think it can be boiled down into this. That okay, so if woman choosing men with a status was a matter of woman not having power, if we get to a society that women have power, or if we get to specific women that are very powerful, we should see that they act more like men, meaning they're indifferent to status power and they choose based on different measures, right? The thing is that that's not what has happened, right? The women who have power and status and they are on top of a social hierarchy did not become indifferent. Not only did they not become indifferent to status and power, they became even more attuned to wealth, power, and social status, right? So that became even more important for them. So, there are a couple of ways that one can respond to this in the sense that, like, maybe the data is not accurate. But if we assume that the data collected there is accurate, then the argument that is being made here is that there is no change really, right? That kind of like the Hegel uses the term the cunning of reason. Here's more like the cunning of nature or cunning of biology. That always kind of sneaks in, right? And even if like maybe like in like a very individual level of things, that woman does not need any resources, but that kind of as if it's some sort of like a you know um, cross-generational trauma that you cannot get rid of, right? It's just like it just kicks in no matter what. It's not dependent on what you have. It's a pattern that is going to unfold. And that's the argument about sexual choice. Right.
No, I think you did a good job summarizing their argument here. That is because a lot of people will say a lot of things are socially constructed. So once you reach a certain threshold, you surpass that limit, you kind of take up different expectation assumptions in life. But this is clearly making the argument that the difference between men and women is biological and psychological. Like regardless of your cultural upbringing, like which class you're born into, you could be princess. But at the end of the day, you still behave and think like female members of a hunter-gatherer group who had been selected mates based on what kind of hunt they can bring back, how powerful they are, how well can they defend their offsprings against like predators, those parameters. So we are still subconsciously thinking about those factors when we're making important choice in like mate selection, even in a very industrialized and modern society. Yes.
Yes. So that's one like point. like that's one strategy to kind of like justify that evolutionary psychology is still in full force. The other strategy reveals itself in the case of gossip. And that's the idea of misapplication of an ancient process, right? And that misapplication is actually proof of stability in spite of cultural changes. And in some ways, again, all these cases kind of get interconnected and they are pointing towards the same direction. But the idea of gossip is that such like information are definitely important for the smaller societies that we're developing. If your whole group is like, at the most like 100 people, right? Like knowing like pieces of information about what happened in that hunting day, that day, and who fell and what happened and who punched whom in the face and which woman had a miscarriage, like all of these information are meaningful in kind of like finding your position in that space. Uh, what happens when we care about Katy Perry and Taylor Swift instead of our neighbors is that it just happens to be the case that Katy Perry is on my face, right? It's just like Taylor Swift is like in my world in a way that is very odd because it's on my phone, but it feels like that she is with me. And just like in that kind of an ancient process, we have developed an interest in kind of detecting and paying attention to shiny things, and now we're glued to like screens, right? That mechanism wasn't developed to deal with like iPhones, but now we have iPhones and the same kind of problem, quote unquote problem, reveals itself and the same thing happens with gossip. It's just like we're doing the same thing just because our brain thinks this person that is actually very distant is part of our social circle because of that kind of a proximity, like the weird proximity that television or like Instagram or places of that kind create, right? Uh, in fact, it is exactly the same, okay, the same structure. And I think it's just like, yeah, it's interesting because just a tiny bit tangential because I am teaching a course on human nature and I ask my students to tell me what they think about human nature. And one of them mentioned as a point about existence of, as an argument for existence of human nature as through marketing, that marketing is the system that actually goes and finds these basic structures, basic psychological mechanisms, and puts us in the position that they are activated and they're used to grab our attention, right? Uh, and like that's just like a version of this story that like we or just like it's a use of this story, another version of this story that like that we're still dealing with the same processes. It's just like things have changed in the way of how the societies are or have been organized, but the same mechanisms live on. Um, that's gossip about celebrities, right?
Yes, I think this case is very interesting in comparison to the first one we just discussed, because they showcase the two important ways how evolutionary psychologists that want to contribute to cultural interpretation. First is that we see a direct universal pattern dictated by our instinct, manifested in completely different cultures, regardless of like their media or like technological status. And this is a different case, but it's like kind of exception to prove the rule, so to speak. That sometimes we observe some seemingly paradoxical stuff like that contradict our prediction with evolution psychology. If like hunter-gatherers pay close attention to information about their close neighbors or kings, but we now pay more attention to celebrities than our family members or like people live next door, it does not disprove that we don't no longer have such a set of instincts, but instead, um, we are our body or our whole like sensory system are not sophisticated enough to detect the deception our mass media provided. Instead of we mistake, say, Katy Perry or whatever, as our like direct king or people very close to us because we see their faces, look, hear their voices like, way more often than any other individuals in our lives. That's true, actually. Yes, to the extent we think they are actually living with us, they're in our immediate in-group of trust. So we care about them. We want to get information about them, hence gossip. So here, like I like the point your student made about marketing. So like marketing or those like PR or whatever, media studies, all they're really doing, or they're powerful and effective because they manipulate um, the necessary unfolding of human nature, but they channel such unfolding, crafted it in a way to fit their very contingently constructed, you can say superstructure, so that the evoked or the manifested cultural pattern looks very different. Because the evolutionary psychologists have no problem admitting every society has the same human nature, but the whole social structure and like cultural behaviors could be extremely different, and that's exactly the realm where like a businessman want to go into. Like you have such a desire, let me just turn your desire into like my profit making opportunities, and I think that's how they think the whole kind of fixed human nature model could be really helpful in understanding, perhaps even changing, to speak of your connection between Marxist sociology and evolutionary psychology, to change the way we actually use our instincts, basically.
Yes. And I think that parallel between the two actually becomes the most clear in a very interesting way in the last case, and in like different directions. And I think that might be very informative. So the last case is a social stratification. I like this kind of discrepancy between social hierarchies. Um, and here it is still an argument from continuity, but it's an argument from continuity that is not exact same structure happening like the case of the sexual choice, but it is about like social conditions not being in the position of the mechanism fully being exposed. So the idea is that hunters gatherers were sensitive to status and hierarchy, right? But the structure of the society that they had and their means of production and access to resources um, were not enough to create a stratified society. And if you don't have excess and everyone basically kind of needs to cooperate to get food and take care of basic things, and then that's it, you got to repeat, then there's not much room for building a mansion or, having a gold chain or like, getting a better property when there is no meaningful way to do that. But when the excess production became a reality due to some contingent facts, right? And human beings started living in bigger cities, then the pursuit of higher rank um, or hierarchy in that sense actually became possible, right? And nepotism and the kind of like preferring kins over others in having resources also became very important, right? Like there was no room for inheritance laws or in hunter-gatherer societies, but if there are inheritance laws for a more sophisticated society, then that emphasis about like rank and position became very important, right? There was no room for kind of building political alliances within like 100 people in a hunter-gatherer society that were always kind of like occupied with like dealing with the basics. But when you had like say like slavery and someone else was doing the work, and you had time to kind of build other social structures, then and slavery of course itself as an expression of this, um, then the stratification became a reality. Basically, the idea is that the potential for stratification was always there because the interest in nepotism and uh, judgment based on the status was there, right? It was just like they were all relatively dormant in hunter-gatherer societies because they didn't have the other conditions. I think the funny part of this to me is how a Marxist would look at the same phenomenon and have the exact opposite, but fundamentally in its logic, the same argument that are now is like our capacity for having a, you know, coherent collective, um, just, kind of a gift economy vibe. That's the thing that is relatively dormant because now we are thrown into a condition that is not conducive to have that type of relationship, right? So Marxists would look exactly in the reverse way. Marxists would look at the capitalist society and say, we're thrown into this kind of like, these social conditions have put us in this kind of atomized individuality, right? Like, think about like being thrown into a suburb in the US or just like, having like even like in terms of like isolation, right? Urban design has put us in a structure, and this is not what we are. This is this is like kind of suppressing the dormant ability for us to live in a society that is completely different. It looks like more like hunter-gatherer societies, right? Evolution psychologists say the opposite. They say that if you go back and look at the hunter-gatherer societies, in their case, there is something very important dormant and suppressed, right? And that's only because of social conditions. But both of them say that something that is real about human nature is dormant because of random social conditions. And the reality is a different organization of human society that is best exemplified with this other type of society. And I think that's a fascinating kind of a, like, when two theories are in fundamental ways exactly the same, but they just have different content. And I think that's always lovely to witness. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I have nothing to say. I just think evolutionary psychology has such uncanny parallels with both Marxism and Buddhism. That really helps me to understand one comment made by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. He said, like, as a Buddhist, I always know socialism is right. I think there's some family resemblance across the three intellectual systems. I think that's all I have to say on this social stratification thing. Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the parallel that you make with Buddhism is itself something very interesting, and it is, I think it's worth uh, diving into that kind of parallel because I think the way that the evolution psychology is um, like looks like Marxism is different from the way that it looks like Buddhism, and in the sense that yeah, there is like that point that you mentioned in the last episode, for instance, about this, like the way that environments really has no authority in a sense. Like environment doesn't have an authority, but that doesn't mean that individual in this kind of a free willy kind of a way has authority either. What has authority is something like a process that kind of runs through the mind and kind of then the phenomena come as a result of it. I think Marxists would be not not completely on par with that, although they could be. But there is this other side of this that they're definitely going to be kind of very much attuned to the basic assumptions of evolution psychology, and that's the point about um, this kind of grand narrative that is for them not necessarily a natural fact, or it's not about psychological mechanism, but it still is about some sort of a human nature that really tells us what is kind of like this structure that is we're destined to have. There is a sense of destiny that is very much present in both Marxism and evolutionary psychology. Now, What we're going to do in the last two episodes that we are going to spend on this book and evolutionary psychology for now is our critical remarks. So we're going to kind of connect these critical remarks to our brand project on human nature, but also more specifically about the details of evolutionary psychology. And from there, we're going to kind of tell you where we think we should go based on these discussions and based on these ideas that we have developed. Trent, any final thoughts?
Nope, I'm just excited to share our critical remarks with our listeners. So stay attuned to our new episodes that are coming up soon.